So a hot topic for some time in novel therapeutics has been phage therapy. Does phage therapy actually work? And if it does, why can't we get it off the ground? We're going to talk about all this and so much more on today's episode of Short Stories of Bacteria. Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Short Stories of Bacteria. I, as always, am your host, Dr. K, and I'm here to guide you through another episode chronicling the lives of the tiny and infamous, and that would be, of course, the incredible and the amazing bacteria. We're going to do something a little bit different today. We're going to be focusing instead on a particular journal article or a particular review article. We're going to be focusing exclusively in on emergent therapy, something that's been coming into the mainstream for the past, couple decades, honestly, at this point, and that is bacteriophage therapy. We're going to talk about that in just a minute, but first, don't forget to hit that like, share, subscribe button if you're listening to the podcast on YouTube. If you're listening to the podcast on something else like Spotify or Apple Podcasts or any other of the podcast mediums, don't forget to hit that follow button to help support the channel and help support the podcast. Enough of that. Let us jump into the actual science of today. I guess the best way to start this, and we've talked about this at length in this podcast before, is that while bacteria are super, super awesome and we use them for pretty much everything, we run into issues whenever bacteria try to take over our own bodies, right? We run into this very common issue of bacteria are growing in a way that we do not want them to grow, and we have to pare them back in some way. Now, the classic way that we do this ever since the discovery of penicillin has been antibiotics. Antibiotics are incredibly useful. They're super awesome and super useful. But the downside is that the more we use antibiotics, the more we have this increased incidence of antibiotic resistance. The more these bacteria are going to be able to fight off that antibiotic to the point where we're starting to run low on antibiotics. And this is an emerging problem for scientists worldwide. And so what that means is that we need to have different mechanisms, different therapeutics whereby we can control the rate of bacterial growth. Now, we've talked a little bit about different kinds on the podcast. Bacteriocins is one that comes to mind. Quorum sensing is one that comes to mind. But one that shows a lot of promise and has been very interesting in the past 2 decades has been bacteriophage therapy. Now, just a real quick recap on bacteriophage therapy, what it is and how it works. It all hinges on the activity of something called bacteriophages. And bacteriophages, if you don't remember, these are viruses that specifically eat bacteria. Bacteriophages, phage essentially meaning eat, and bacteria, which is pretty close to the word bacteria. So bacteriophage therapy, how it works is you have, I guess we should probably talk about how bacteriophages work. Bacteriophages, what they are, is they have, you may have seen them in like a high school biology textbook. They have these little like long legs that look like a little spider or a little alien, and then they have this crystal-like head that sits on top of the legs, and those legs attach to the skin, the membrane of the bacteria, and as it attaches, then the bacteriophage drops its own DNA or RNA inside the bacteria. Once that DNA or RNA is inside the bacteria, then it can actually replicate itself and generate more bacteriophages on the interior of the bacteria before they explode out the side of the bacteria, right? So that kills that bacteria and it causes the bacteriophages to be spread to the surrounding bacteria, right? So one bacteriophage could very easily destroy a whole colony of bacteria. Now, what's really cool about bacteriophages and why they're so useful therapeutically is that they're extremely, extremely specific in what they target, okay? One bacteriophage will focus in on one type of bacteria, right? There may be some play in the joints and what it can attach to, but those legs are very, very specific in terms of what they attach to, right? And so it can only attach to one different type of bacteria. Now, what's really awesome about this is that means that if you have a specific type of bacteria that's growing inside you, right, and it's not, and you don't want it to be growing, right, but you also don't want to kill all of the other bacteria in your gut, which you would do if you had an antibiotic, right? Instead of using an antibiotic, you could just use one particular phage that could kill that specific type of bacteria, and it would leave the rest of your microbiome totally intact, right? Now, what's also really cool, so that's one thing, they're extremely specific, so they won't disrupt the rest of your microbiome. What's also really cool is that there's tons and tons and tons of bacteriophages out there. And turns out there's more bacteriophages out there than there are bacteria in the world, right? There's tons of bacteriophages. And what that means then, this is our first point, is that bacteriophage therapy, because there's so many bacteriophages out there and because they're so specific in what they target, bacteriophage therapy is a theoretically limitless way that we could stop bacteria. Okay, so that's our first point. Now, this could lead you to a question like, oh, gee, Dr. K, here you are praising phage therapy. It's all very well and good, but why hasn't it become mainstream? Why don't we have phage therapy all over the place? Why are we using antibiotics anymore if this phage therapy is such a useful idea? And that's a really, really good question. And there's a whole bunch of different reasons why. There was a cool, let me bring this up here. There was a cool review article. It's kind of old at this point. It came out in 2011. But it started talking about the different pros and cons of bacteriophage therapy. And it's not exhaustive by any stretch, but it does get some of the really important points here. First of all, and I guess before I go further in here, I should specify that the cons side of this article breaks it down into several key segments. The first one is just from a safety perspective. We have a live bacteriophage virus, right? And we're injecting it into a human. We're putting it into a human, right? First of all, should we be injecting viruses into humans to begin with? That's the first question. And second of all, is that going to impact the immune system in a really dramatic way, right? That's the first one. Are these things safe? Now, actually, there's a couple of really good points here that indicate that it's actually just fine. The first bit is, and before we even get into the discussion of are bacteriophages themselves safe? The first point that I want to make here is that viruses in themselves aren't necessarily awful, right? We actually have our own virome. We have our own microbiome. We have our own bacteria. We also have our own virome, our own phages, our own viruses that we keep on our body. And we have symbiotic isn't the correct word for it, but they also cultivate and participate with our own body. So just because it's a virus in and of itself doesn't mean that it's a bad thing, right? The second point is that even though you would think that injecting bacteriophages into a body would trigger some kind of dramatic immune response and our immune system would just totally lose it and try and kill us and kill all the viruses as well, that's kind of true, but not really in the way that you would think. There's a really cool systematic review that looked at phage therapy from clinical data from 2000 to 2021. So this came out in 2022. And what this systematic review found is that there really weren't a whole lot of adverse events when people did this personalized phage therapy. When people took these bacteriophage therapy, it didn't seem like it was impacting people really at all. The bacteriophages just killed the bacteria and then they kind of died off because what they were trying to kill was gone, right? So there weren't any real negative side effects from doing this phage therapy. What is interesting is that our immune system is aware that there's a bacteriophage that's floating around, and depending on the situation, sometimes it does respond. It responds a little bit. The downside of that is, the good side of that is that, great, our immune system seems like it's working. The downside is that actually makes the bacteriophage therapy even worse. There was another paper that came out in, let me look and see, this is in 2021, and what happened is there was a phage therapy that was trying to target a mycobacterial infection, something called Mycobacterium abscessus. And what happened was the immune system started to respond to the bacteriophage and started killing the bacteriophage. But the downside of that is that now the bacteriophage couldn't kill the bacteria, right? So while it seems that these bacteriophages is our second point, that even though it would seem like getting phaged would be a bad idea, number one, it seems pretty safe. And number two, if our immune system does respond to it, that's all it's going to do is cheapen the therapy. The second major issue that this review pointed out is that bacteria aren't just going to sit there. They're not going to just sit there and let themselves die. So bacteria are going to try and evolve. And in fact, that is one of the coolest arms races in the world right now, is the arms race between bacteriophages and bacteria. Bacteria are always trying to adapt and overcome their local bacteriophages, and the bacteriophages, they're like, well, I still have to eat something, and so then they try to evolve to kill the newly evolved bacteria. So there's this back and forth evolution of bacteria and bacteriophages. It's really, really wild. Now, The bright side for bacteriophage therapy is that bacteriophages, because they're so much smaller, because they have a much smaller genome, they're able to evolve a lot faster than bacteria, right? So the overall diversity of bacteriophages tends to be greater than that of the bacteria. And what this means then is that even though bacteria are going to keep on evolving, if we have a broad enough base, a broad enough library of bacteriophages, we should never run out of bacteriophages that could kill that specific bacteria. Okay? So point number 3, while bacteria are going to continue to evolve, this doesn't pose a threat to the efficacy of phage therapy because there's so many other bacteriophages and all of them are evolving as well. Okay? Now, this gets into the actual problem with phage therapy, or the biggest problem in my mind with phage therapy. Because these bacteria continually evolve, that means that not only are there going to be bacteriophages that are evolving to meet that newly evolved bacteria, but that means that only very, very specific types of phages will be able to combat and attack that bacteria. Okay? Different bacterial infections are going to have slightly different types of bacteria, and so they're going to get targeted by slightly different bacteriophages. What this means then is that it's really, really hard to make a one-size-fits-all therapy using bacteriophages. Because bacteria are so diverse, right, it's difficult for you to be like, oh, okay, here's one bacteriophage, and we're going to use this one bacteriophage as a way of combating all these different kinds of infections. There was a recent article that came out, I think it was in 2024. Let me check and see. Well, I'll check that later. There was a recent article within the past 2 years, and what it pointed out is that a one-size-fits-all series of bacteriophage products leads to a lot less effective therapeutics, right? So you can't just take one cluster of bacteriophages and expect that to work for everybody because of the diversity of bacteria. Now, again, that's not a huge issue because as long as we look hard enough, we can find a bacteriophage that can kill that newly evolved bacteria. But the downside is it makes it really hard to follow good manufacturing practices if you're a company, right? So if I could frame this another way, there's no money to be made in a specific combination of bacteriophages because that specific combination of bacteriophages could very easily be obsolete in a short time, or it could be obsolete right out of the gate because of the inherent diversity of bacterial species. Now, again, we can still overcome this. We just need more specific bacteriophages. But what that means is that now we're starting get into the realm of personalized medicine, right? And personalized medicine, while it's awesome and it seems like that's going to be the future of our own type of medicine if we can get there, it's really hard to do personalized medicine at scale, right? You can make a whole bunch of bacteriophages that are specific to your own personal bacterial infection, but that's going to be extremely, extremely expensive. Now, this is not a hopeless situation by any stretch. In general, as we've seen, bacteriophage therapy seems to be a really good therapy. It seems like it works really well. It seems like it doesn't, even though it can get compromised by the immune system, it seems like it's okay. But at this point, we don't seem to have the infrastructure yet to be able to handle bacteriophage therapy at a larger scale. Now, there are some other ideas. There's some ways that we can make bacteriophage therapy a little easier. There's something called the Phage directory, which is super, super cool. It's out of a university, I think it's the University of Sydney. And what they're doing is they're making this huge, huge library of phages that are associated with general types of bacteria, right? So if you have a vanilla style type of bacterial infection, right, then you have a baseline type of bacteriophage that can be used to kill that particular bacterial infection. And in theory, as you expand that phage directory, number one, you're more likely to find a bacteriophage that will work if you have a specific type of bacterial infection. And number two, if you need to evolve these different types of phages in the future, then you have at least a good jumping off point if you need to evolve something really quickly. So that's going to be a really interesting topic down the road, but let's wrap this up. Number one, bacteriophage therapy is theoretically limitless way that we can stop bacteria. Number two, even though it would seem like getting phaged would be bad, it seems to be pretty safe and that our immune system does tend to keep these guys in check. Point number three, evolution of bacteria doesn't really pose a threat to the efficacy of phage therapy because bacteriophages evolve faster than bacteria. point number 4, because individual bacteria and phages are unique, it's really hard to make phage therapies at scale with one type of bacteria phage. And that means that most therapies have to be highly personalized, which means that they're going to be expensive. So the overall quest to control our microbiome is going to continue. I have no doubt in the future that we'll be trying to use phage therapy to control that microbiome, but until then, we'll just have to we're going to have to just let science keep on poking around and exploring what the ins and outs of bacteriophage therapy. Anyway, that is enough for me today. This is a long episode, but I hope you guys learned something. I hope you guys enjoyed, and I hope I will see you guys again next week on another episode of Short Stories of Bacteria.